your helper functions are so important. So the most important ones that you have are sort of the ones that set a GPIO to a certain mode and the modify bit field function, because you're going to be configuring so many different peripherals. You don't want to rewrite that long bit mask and shift string like 100 times. You want to make a single function call to it with the right constants that does what you want. So you really need to work on getting those helper functions together. A couple of the registers that we talked about for the USART or the UART, the control register, that controls the baud rate, whether it's synchronous, asynchronous mode, a lot of basic sort of parameters. Command turns it on and off. Status tells you what's going on with the peripheral. A communications peripheral is going to have lots of status indicators. Are you currently sending? Are you done sending? Is the buffer empty? Has your message been sent? Is it in the middle of being sent? There's a lot of configuration information in the status register. You've got your clock divider. As with all peripherals, that slows down the bus clock to be the clock speed that you need. You have transmit and receive buffers that buffer your incoming and outgoing data. And you've got, of course, your interrupt flags. Something to talk about right now, which gets to be important, is this route register. The route register. So, when you're working with GPIO, you know which one you're working with directly. If you're modifying port E, you're modifying port E's pins. But when you have a USART, when you have a timer connected to an external device, they do not naturally have pins associated with them. The mapping between the peripherals and the GPIO is not fixed. It can be modified. And that makes sense because maybe sometimes you want to use all 4 timers and connect them externally, and nothing else talks to an external device. So your GPIO are truly general purpose, and you can remap them to different functionalities. And if you remember the diagram from the GPIO, there was all this stuff kind of up here in the top where it's talking about alternate functions. And there's alternate function output enable and data out. And what it does is, this is the natural output from the GPIO, but it can AND it, and it can mask it, and it can overwrite that output. So normally, if you write to the D out register for your GPIO, it will turn that pin high if it's an output. But if you configure it for alternate functionality, that out register no longer controls this physical pin. It is controlled by some alternate function. That alternate function is determined by the route register. So every peripheral has a route register that helps you route its functionality to different GPIO pins. The route is set by the manufacturer. So you can't map any arbitrary peripheral to any arbitrary pins, but you have a large selection. So in each peripheral, you might have 4 or 5 different locations that the pins can be sent to. So inside the route register, there is a field called location, and you are picking the location that your peripheral's pins get sent to. So location 0, 1, 2, and so on. All the information about the route pins is in the Giant Gecko datasheet, not in the reference manual. I don't know why this information is split between the 2 documents, but it is in the datasheet. It is not in the reference manual. And so if you look at the datasheet, all you get is several tables that tell you either for a certain pin what functionality can be associated with that pin. So pin A4, which is the physical name for the actual pin, is considered logically port E pin 9. So A4 is PE9, and it can support these different functionalities. So it can support something from the 7-segment display. It can support something from the EBI, which I don't even know what that is, timers, communication, and so on. The way that you want to read this is that the word is sort of the functional name of the pin, and the pound sign is the location number. So if you want to make PE4 associated with USART, the chip select pin, you would use route 1 in UART 0. So this is actually a really terrible table, and the one that you want is this. This is the same. It's another table right below this one. So the idea is that if you're dealing with the I squared C, the 0th I squared C object, which is the UART 0, if you use location 0 in the route register, pins A1 and A0 get associated with the clock and data lines. If you use location 1, pins D7 and D6 get associated. If you use location 6, then PE13 and PE12 get associated. So the idea is that in the peripheral, you set the location where you want that functionality to end up. And the chip takes care of routing that functionality to the appropriate GPIO. Really important note, this does not configure your GPIO for that purpose. Super note again. Simply routing the functionality there does not configure that GPIO for that purpose. If this is a clock line, which needs to be an output, you still have to configure that pin as an output. This is a data line, and in I2C it's both an input and an output. You need to configure the pin for that functionality. So, in the assignment you're going to have for Wednesday, which you're going to do in class, you're going to have the UART loop back on itself. So you're going to connect its transmit pin directly to its receive pin, and you're going to talk to itself much like I talk to myself in the cat. So, if you want to use, depending on what location you pick, you get certain pins. So if you leave it with a default of 0, then the receive functionality is on PE11, and the transmit functionality is on PE10. If you change the location, it gets routed to different pins. So a real important note here that you can take the default, but then you can also change where it's routed. This is what it would look like inside the route register for the UART. You have default routing of location 0, but you have 5 other choices. An important note about this is that the location maps all functional pins to a different group. So you can't map half of UART's pins to one location and the other half to a different. They get all mapped to the same group. So when you're doing this, you have to pick the location that you want. And you might want to ask yourself, well crap, what pins do I actually route it to? I mean, there's probably 1,000 pins on your chip, but only a handful of them are exposed. In the user manual, and in these nice little consumer diagrams, you can see for this board what functionality is actually broken out. So this right here are the exposed right angle header pins on the end of your board. Over here are the unpopulated vias and through holes on your board as well. For the sake of convenience, throughout most of the class, we're going to use the one already populated with headers because I don't really want you soldering into the boards. So, the way that you want to read this is that this pin here is connected to 3 volts. The next pin is 5 volts. You've got a ground pin on the other side of it. And then what's labeled is the physical GPIO names, so PD6, PD5, PD4, and on and on and on. But they also have put nice little blocks on there to tell you functionally what is associated. So here, if you can read this, this will say UART 1, pound 2. So that means if you have UART 1 in location 2, its receive pin is here. If, in the same way, this can also map to the functionality of the I2C unit if it's in location 1, and that would be its data line. So you can see for each set of pins, there is a variety of functionality that can be associated with it. These pins here can also be analog inputs, and these pins over here can also be analog outputs. It depends on what functionality you route to that pin, and it depends on how you have that pin configured. Now, what happens if you route 2 functionalities to the same pin? I don't know. They probably fight it out. It probably depends on the configuration that you set. I sure as heck know that it won't work and you'll be frustrated. questions on this diagram? Because I have this uploaded on Schoology, and when you do the assignment on Wednesday, I'm just going to tell you route to these pins. I'm going to tell you come up here and grab, if I can find them, some of these like female wires, so you can just wrap yourself around and use those to connect your pins together. It's easier to use these exposed pins than it is to have you solder in a bunch of headers. Okay. This is just sort of another diagram, sort of showing it broken out more. You can see that USART 1, location 3, its pins are here. USART 0, location 1, its pins are here. And sort of the way if you were doing this in practice, what you'd say is you look at all the peripherals you have, and if they don't have any pin conflicts, well, then great. If they do, then you have to sort of map them to different locations. And hopefully there are enough pins and there are enough variability in their connections that you can expose all of your functionality. Because imagine if you needed analog out and analog out was fixed, well then you could never get these I2C pins, and maybe you need like all 2 I2Cs, and if that's the only thing that it's mapped to, you're sort of blowing up and you can't access that functionality. So, you will, in the future, for this upcoming lab, I will tell you what pins to set and what route to use. In the future, I'll just give you the pin numbers, and you need to go to this table in the data sheet, and you need to figure out what location it is. Ben, is that a question?
Yeah, is there a way to configure things to
Is there a way we can break things? Yes. So there's probably general bad things you can do with GPIO. Bad things that can happen with GPIO. You can tie power to ground without any resistors or any elements in the way. So imagine if you routed some other functionality to here and then made this then accidentally configured the GPIO as an input with no pull down resistor. So then it's just draining right to ground. So any voltage you put through here is going to drain automatically through this. If you're operating on a bus, and let's say you've got multiple pins on it, and they're both set to be outputs, well now they can possibly be pushing against each other, and they can try to, depending on which has the higher potential, they might burn the other up. Yes, there are lots of ways that you can use GPIO poorly. So that's why when I was talking about before about serial, really know the voltage levels that you're talking about. And the trouble is going to be is if you burn up one of these pins, let's say you blow up some of the AND gates and stuff in here, you may be able to still write to this register, and your Simplicity Studio is going to tell you, oh yeah, it works, but nothing physically happens. You can easily burn up individual pins. There's also maximum current limits for every pin, because if you pull too much current through here, you're going to burn up these muxes and these tri-states and these AND gates, and there's not going to be that. So yes, there's lots of bad things you can do. So make sure you never put outputs against each other, you never connect power directly to ground, and you try not to have 2 functionalities fighting for the same thing. That's my general comment on that. Okay, what we're going to get into now is specifically on this processor, how do you set it up to use the UART? So we've talked generally about how UART works. Remember that there's a start bit. That's where it pulls the data line down. It then bangs out a collection of data, but it bangs out that data without a clock. You're just hoping that you're in sync, you're simpatico. And then when it's done, it lets the transmit line go back high to indicate that the transmission is over. This is sort of the most simple protocol that you can have. It's sort of like an old school telegraph system where I can just take a flashlight, I can shine it at Nick, and he's going to count the amount of time it's on and off, and well, I've transmitted him a message, but also blinded him. So the way that this works functionally, is that to start a transmission, you put data in the TX data buffer. So So TX data is where you put your data and then it gets copied into the shift register. Once stuff is in the shift register, it gets shifted out automatically based upon the clock rate that you've set up. At the same time, you also have to have the bit transmit enabled set. And the reason when we were going over the bits last class is because there's tri-state disable, there's transmit, like set polarity, like there's lots of flags that look like TX something. And you don't want all of them. You want TX enabled. You got to make sure you're dealing with the right bits. So you enable transmission, you put data in the buffer, boom, data goes out. The reverse is true. As soon as you enable receive, so RX enable, if data comes in, boom, it ends up in the RX data buffer. You don't have to do anything to receive data. You receive data automatically. That data is read in, and then if you remember, there's a 2-sample or a 2-message FIFO that will copy the message up and copy the message up. So you can store a total of 3 messages on the receive line before you have to do something about it. There are many status flags and interrupt flags that occur. So the transmit underflow occurs when the transmit buffer is empty. So the device went to go grab some data to transmit it, and it goes, uh-oh, the buffer's empty. This doesn't necessarily indicate an error. You may want to have the buffer empty because you may be done sending data. It's just an acknowledgement to the processor of saying, hey, I'm done, you got any more work for me? And if you don't, great. And if you do, we'll just give it some more data and we'll go back to transmitting. Same thing for receive overflow. And this one you probably generally always need to deal with. Receive overflow is when the receive buffers are too full. There's no more space for any data, and so that packets that are coming in are just getting dropped. So if the shift register is full and the receive buffers are full, then new data has no place to go coming in, and generally one of 2 things is going to happen. It's either going to drop the new data, or it's going to overwrite your existing data. In general, it's going to keep the data that you have, and it's going to drop the new stuff that's coming in. So you're going to miss any new messages. You can avoid this by responding to the receive full flag. RX full means my buffers are full, I'm about to overflow. So you better come here, grab some data, and do something with it. And normally that's the processor doing that, but if you set up DMA or that peripheral reflex system, it could be another peripheral that responds to that interrupt flag. Depends on how you have it set up. There are a couple status flags in the status register that indicate these states. Receive data V means I got some data. How much? I don't know. I got some data. So it could be 1, it could be 2, but RX full means that you've got 2. So data available means I have at least 1 piece of data for you. RX full means I got 2 pieces of data for you, and I'm about to run out of room. RX overflow means I'm completely full of data, and I'm going to drop the next thing I get. So you get sort of 3 interrupts or 3 flags that correspond to the different states of the receive buffer. The process for sending and receiving is not that complicated. As I said, you just put data in the transmit buffer, and if it's enabled, it goes away. If you were then wanting to wait for something, you can sit and wait for one of those receive interrupts, or you can pull on that data valid bit and wait until some data arrives, and then you read it from RX data. So you read directly from RX data. And what you're going to do is basically just this in the loopback assignment. You're just going to put a wire on your processor and have it loop back itself and talk. Lab 3, when you get back from break, will be your Gecko talking to an Arduino, talking to your PC. So your Arduino is just going to operate as a middleman and pass messages between the two. And it's a sort of a weird configuration for two reasons. One is that, honestly, like now you're communicating with a device in the middle and you need to figure out how to pass information kind of across several devices. Two is that the Arduino actually works as a nice level translator and a COM port translator, and we'll need to have a level shifter object in there. So your UART cannot talk directly to your PC. Remember that whole rant about serial and RS-232 and all that? You can't take your two RX and TX pins and connect them to your USB port because it's not USB format. So we send it to an Arduino. The Arduino packages it up and sends it over its USB terminal. So that's the general procedure there. Put data in the transfer buffer, boom, gone. Look at the RX interrupt, look at the data valid bit, wait for something to occur, read it out of the buffer. Now here's the not fun part. It's kind of tedious to set all this up. Remember, you've got to first figure out, well, what clocks do I need? What pins am I going to use? How do I configure those pins? Then you got to configure the peripheral itself, and then you got to throw some data in the peripheral. So it's a long step. It's a long set of steps to actually even get started sending and receiving data. So you have to do these 5 steps before you even get to these 3 steps of actually doing anything. Now, the idea, though, is that you have been developing helper functions that should make this kind of easy. So, enable the relevant clocks. Well, we give that to you. That's done. Configure the GPIO. Well, for this lab, in the previous lab, you should have written a function that was called configure GPIO. Set up the clock, divide, the data, the parity. You're going to have to calculate all those constants, but you should have a modify bit field function that'll say modify UART 0, comma 63 or whatever this number is, comma 8, because that's the bit field of this. And then boom, it's done. Same thing with route, same thing. You have a write bit function here. You should, while it's annoying to sort of configure, you should be writing these helper functions such that when you get to this, you're just thinking about configuration information, not, well, how the heck do I actually set those bits? So, this is given to you. This you have to look up in the data sheet for which pins you want. This is dependent upon your actual communication protocol. And so, if the task for you, so I could give you some sort of instruction like this. Okay, say set up UART 0 for 52,008N1 and location 1. So that fully specifies. I don't have that fully specifies sort of what I want you to do. So, Jason, help me break down that live there at the start. Which UART am I talking to?
0.
And what is the baud rate for that? 52,000. So when you see something specified like this, 52,000 means that is the baud rate. Travis, how many bits am I sending in my packet?
8.
Okay. And Ben Dimchek, how many parity bits am I using? Yes, none. And then Michael Allen, how many stop bits am I doing? 1. So that's exactly the way you read that out. Is it's 52,000 baud rate, 8 data bits, no parity bits, 1 stop bit. All of that implies, and it's also on the bottom bullet, which is nah. It also implies what you have to configure it for. So that means that you need to translate all of this information into configuration that goes in the peripheral. The other thing that you got to figure out is, remember, we spent some time calculating the baud rate. We spent some time figuring out how you configure the device to talk at a certain baud. Remember, the key factor there was the desired baud rate and then the amount of oversample. In general, you want as much oversample as you can get because that means that you're going to have more samples of your bit and it's going to be more accurate. More specifically, though, you want to minimize the delta between the actual baud rate and the desired baud rate so you're accurate there. So you kind of want to minimize that down to about being a %1 off. And then if you've got still free space, use the oversample. So if you use the equation that we have earlier in the lecture to calculate the clock divider, assuming this baud rate and assuming this oversample rate and a bus frequency of 14 megahertz, you calculate the value of 63.307. But as we talked about, you can't put 0.307 in a register, so you actually would have to write in the number 63, not the fraction rate. You just sort of round down or round up, whatever makes the most sense. So the way that this looks in code is step 1. Enable all of the relevant clocks. So here's your code here that enables all the relevant clocks. So the high frequency peripheral clock, the GPIO clock, and the UART clock. Don't forget to enable the GPIO clock. If you enable your peripherals clock, but then don't enable the clock for the GPIO, you'll route all that functionality there, but then nothing will happen because your GPIO are not turned on. In general, for anything you do on this chip, you're going to at least have these two lines here because you've got to turn on the bus and then you've got to turn on the GPIO. Second thing is location 1 implies certain pins. And so location 1 for this device is PD1 and PD0. So that means that you have to configure your transmit pin to be an output and your receive pin to be an input. If you don't configure those pins, routing the functionality there won't do anything. You still have to manually configure the pin. You have to then set up all of the parameters. You have to set up all of the parameters for this device. So now you need to go into the UART's configuration, set up the divider, the data bits, the stop bits, and the parity. So the divider, as we said, is 63.307. You're not going to write 0.307 in there. You're going to write whatever the hex equivalent of 63 is. Data bits, you're going to put in 8, or whatever value corresponds to 8 data bits. The fact that it's 8 data bits doesn't mean that you write the number 8 into that register. You have to look at the configuration and say, what value do I put in here that indicates 8 bits? Same with stop, same with parity. So for here, for divide, you want it to be 63, which is the same as hex 3F. So 3F goes in this register. Data bits, you don't write 8, you write 5, which is the default value, so you don't have to do anything, because 5 corresponds to 8 data bits in the packet. 1 stop bit. Looky here, you actually do write 1, but that's the default, so you don't have to do anything. And the same thing for parity. Now, when you set the location in the route register, the route register is, I think it's a 3 or 4 bit field, and so you're going to use location 1, so you're going to write the value 1 into that register. Don't forget to enable transmit receive and enable receive in your command register. Don't forget to enable that in the command register to enable the reception and transmission. So here's your summary on this. The Gecko has a peripheral called a UART. The U part means universal and the A part means asynchronous. So UART is an asynchronous peripheral, meaning it has no clock. It has no clock line. It can also support USART as meaning synchronous operations which involve SPI and I2C. These are communication peripherals we will get to, but who have clocks in them. because it does all three functionalities, it has really flexible configuration, which is awesome because it can do many things, but it's not awesome because that means there's a lot of configuration bits that you have to wade through to figure out what's going on. So, really take your time setting the packet size, checking your interrupts, checking your flags, all of these different things that your peripheral might need. Configuring your peripheral does not configure the GPIO associated with that functionality. You need to manually configure those GPIO as well. Remember that any data that you have in the RX or TX buffer has a two-level FIFO, meaning that you can store 2 received packets in the FIFO, and you can store 2 transmitted packets in the FIFO, so you don't have to service each reception or each transmission manually. As I said, you'll have an assignment Wednesday where we'll make this work in a loopback configuration, and then you will have a lab once you get back actually making this talk to other devices. And if you want to see sort of what that assignment will look like, it's on the next couple slides here, but we will not be getting to that today. We'll be getting to it on Wednesday, and I'll write up just a teeny little document on it. So, Bill, questions?
You have to deal with like the transmit and receive enable that's in between messages, or is that pretty much just straight setup?
No, once you enable transmission, enable reception, it's on. And like with the timer, there was a start timer, stop timer. The corresponding actions here are physically putting the data in the buffer. So as soon as you write data to the transmit buffer, it goes. There's not a, hey, here's data, start transmitting. As soon as data enters the buffer, it's sent out. Same way with reception. As soon as data is received, it's put in the receive buffer and the flag is raised. So there is not a corresponding sort of start, stop, send, don't send functionality. Once it's on, it's on. Because, especially on the receive side, like once it's set up to receive, like data can come in at any time. Is the idea. You start not on exam 1. So it's just the first 4 lectures. It's just assignments 1 and 2. It's lab 1 and 2. Exam 1, again, is very conceptual about how things work and what they do and how they're connected. Much, much less on sort of writing code. I may have you write like a snippet of code, but this is not a CS 201 exam where I'm giving you a programming portion and you have to implement something. So for clarification. So let me